When most of us now read Young Pioneers, the new title given to Let the Hurricane Roar in the late 1970s after a television spin-off from the Little House TV series, we make associations between Lane's novel and her mother's Little House books. We recognize that the main character, Charles or David Beaton in Young Pioneers, more about the name change later, sounds very much like Wilder's pa, Charles Ingalls. He was laughing and bold, a daring hunter, a dancer, fiddler, and fighter. As for Caroline in Lane's novel, Molly in Young Pioneers, she was a quiet person who never loses that wonder that she had won such a man as Charles. And just like Ma and Pa in Little House in the Big Woods, they both moved west from the big woods of Wisconsin. But when the original novella was published in 1932 as a serial in the Saturday Evening Post, the only Little House book that existed was in fact Little House in the Big Woods, which at that time was an obscure children's book from a first-time children's book author. Lane's materials, her main characters notwithstanding, seemed new and fresh. Furthermore, even Wilder hadn't envisioned her whole series yet. In late 1932, she was working on revisions for this book, which, like Little House in the Big Woods, was not about homesteaders moving west. Although it was a story about American life in the 1800s, the plot and characters in Farmer Boy were contented with life on the farm. The novel wasn't about carving out a new life on the frontier. Because Let the Hurricane Roar seemed so new, so distinctly different, reviewers raved about the book. It seemed to be at once a book about the past and a book about the present, inspiring hope and courage during the darkest days of the Depression. In a way, the story is fiction, but more truly, it is a thrilling chapter of American history, for the characters the author chooses to call Charles and Caroline might be any pair of the thousands upon thousands of hardy young pioneers who wrote with their axes and rifles and plowshares the epic of the West. Lane herself embraced this idea of her work. She proclaimed that Let the Hurricane Roar reflected her affirmation in the American spirit. The book was a reply to pessimists and written from my feeling that living is never easy, that all human history is a record of achievement in disaster. Yet, as no one suspected in 1932 and 1933, Lane's material for this book wasn't original. It sprang from Pioneer Girl. So let's start our discussion of Let the Hurricane Roar, or Young Pioneers, with a brief examination, and by no means an exhaustive examination, of the parallels between Wilder's autobiography and Lane's novel. I want to point out that for the purposes of this lecture, I'm just giving you a few examples. There are far more parallels and connections between the two works than we can realistically cover today. Lane skipped over the first two big chunks of Pioneer Girl, her mother's memories in Indian Territory and the big woods of Wisconsin. But she raided the pioneer heart of the memoir, the Ingalls family's experiences along Plum Creek in Minnesota and Silver Lake in Dakota Territory. Along the way, Lane lifted and lightly veiled her mother's memories of grasshopper plagues, the coming of the railroad, the Dakota Land Boom, and the hard winter of 1880-1881, and mushed and molded them together to form a short, tightly constructed novella that deals with archetypes. More about the archetypes later. Now that we have access to Pioneer Girl and the Little House books, of course, we can see how thinly veiled many of Lane's changes really are. Plum Creek in Pioneer Girl, for example, becomes Wild Plum Creek in Lane's novel, complete with a dugout, immigrant neighbors, the Svensons in Hurricane, the Nelsons in Pioneer Girl, and a previous homesteader who had made the initial improvements to the property, the dugout, barn, and had broken sod. The railroad town that emerges in Pioneer Girl, DeSmet, Dakota Territory, becomes the unnamed and archetypal railroad town in Let the Hurricane Roar. Wilder's own Aunt Dosha of Pioneer Girl becomes the blousy woman who runs the railroad camp in Let the Hurricane Roar. Like Aunt Dosha, Lane's character in her novel has children who ride wild black ponies. And like the real Ingalls family, Lane's Charles and Caroline, or David and Molly in Young Pioneers, twist haystacks to burn for fuel during a lengthy and violent blizzard. Let's look at a few examples, details, and episodes lifted from Pioneer Girl and then placed in Let the Hurricane Roar. Here's a scene, for example, from Pioneer Girl. Just beyond the dooryard were some cattle standing motionless with their heads hanging. Later, when they had not moved, we wondered why they didn't go to the haystacks, and because they looked strange, standing still so long with their heads hanging, Paul went out to see what was the matter. He found that their breath in the snow, blown into their eyelashes and the hair around their eyes, had formed ice over their eyes until they could not see at all. Paul went up to one after another and tore the ice from their eyes. As soon as they could see, they bawled and ran from him. Here's the corresponding passage in Let the Hurricane Roar. The cattle did not move. She went within 10 yards of them, 5, 2. They did not lift their heads. Over their eyes, thick over the eyes and hollow temples, were cakes of ice. When she saw this, she understood. Their own breath, streaming upward while they plodded before the storm, had frozen and blinded them. In a rage of pity, an outbursting cry against the universal cruelty, she plunged through the snow to the nearest patiently dying creature. She wrenched the ice from its eyes. The steer snorted. He flung up his head in terror and ran, staggering. One significant change here. Lane adds a layer of emotion to her story. She doesn't trust her readers as Wilder ultimately does. The line, a rage of pity, an outbursting cry against the universal cruelty, ultimately detracts from the scene. Here's what I mean. Let's jump ahead about 7 years to 1940 and the long winter. They did not seem like real cattle. They stood so terribly still. In the whole herd, there was not the least movement. Only their breathing sucked their hairy sides in between the rib bones and pushed them out again. Their hip bones and their shoulder bones stood up sharply. Their legs were braced out, stiff and still. And where their heads should be, swollen white lumps seemed fast to the ground under the blowing snow. On Laura's head, the hair prickled up and a horror went down her backbone. Tears from the sun and the wind swelled out her staring eyes and ran on her cold cheeks. Pa went slowly against the wind. He walked up to the herd. Not one of the cattle moved. For a moment, Pa stood looking. Then he stooped and quickly did something. Laura heard a bellow, and a red steer's back humped and jumped. The red steer ran staggering and bawling. Another one bellowed and ran a short, staggering run, then another. Pa was doing the same thing to them all, one by one. The bawling rose up to the cold sky. This is a masterful scene, a transformation from the autobiography of Pioneer Girl to the fiction of the Long Winter. Wilder's concrete details, her simple yet vivid language, make this episode come alive. Readers experience it through Laura, but never once does Wilder stop to tell readers how to feel, or even how Laura feels. This is an emotional scene, but not a sentimental one, as Lane's version is. This is something that Lane and Wilder argued about in their roles as editor and writer. Lane argued for more sentiment in the Little House books, and Wilder wisely argued against it. And then just one more example from Pioneer Girl and Let the Hurricane Roar, that grasshopper plague. It covers several pages in Pioneer Girl, but here's one especially vivid passage. Just then we heard someone call, and Mrs. Nelson was in the doorway. "The grasshoppers are coming, the grasshoppers are coming," she shrieked. We raised our faces and looked straight into the sun. It had been shining brightly, but now there was a light-colored, fleecy cloud over its face. And then we saw that the cloud was grasshoppers, their wings shining white, making a screen between us and the sun. They were dropping to the ground like hail in a hailstorm, faster and faster. Here's the corresponding scene in Let the Hurricane Roar. A cloud was coming from the northwest, moving swiftly over the sun. It was a cloud like none that Caroline had ever seen. This was a cloud ineffably beautiful, soft as moonbeams, iridescent as mother of pearl. It covered the sun, and the sun shone through it gently, with kindness. The edge of the cloud moved onward swiftly, evenly. It moved above the windless prairie with the speed of the wind. Caroline thought there was a pattering like rain on the grass around her, but she could only see rustling blades and springing grasshoppers. As you can see, the similarities between Let the Hurricane Roar and Pioneer Girl are striking. In our next lecture, we'll see how Rose Wilder Lane reinterpreted her mother's material and projected her own creative, social, and political ideas on the story.